Hello. So as stated, Nick Fortugno. I'm going to talk. What I'd like to do is offer an idea, which is that when we think about storytelling in a transmedial way, and we start thinking about what it means when we talk about the interactive side of that, I want to suggest that there are other ways to tell stories than to listen to them, or to watch them, or to read them. That there are ways to play stories. There's ways to interact with stories. And I want to talk about a little bit a theoretical framework based on work to help you as transmedial designers or people interested in transmedial design to think about, well, what would it mean if I made an interactive, or I made a game, or I made an experience that someone's going to play with that could tell my story as well as these other forms. And what I want to suggest is the methodology is different. You can do it, but it works differently. So to do that, I want to talk a little bit about some of my own work to start. So this is a piece called Body Mind Change, and it was a transmedial project that I worked on with a designer named Lance Weiler, who's a pretty famous transmedial designer. Everyone Power to the Pixel Connected knows Lance. Lance is one of the planets that orbits around that sun. We got hired by David Cronenberg and by the Canadian Board of Cinema to work on a transmedial piece for a David Cronenberg retrospective. So if you're familiar with David Cronenberg's work, we're talking about, like his early work, like the existences and the scanners, like the gross body stuff. And so we made this piece called Body Mind Change, and in Body Mind Change, we set up a website where you were going to get download a pod, which was going to be a recommendation engine that would be plugged into your body, that would pick movies for you, and that you were programming the pod with an artificial intelligence so it could pick things better. And so the piece itself, what you did when you went to the website, had a bunch of different parts. Some of it was video. It was like a bunch of short video narratives that were exploring ethical situations that you were supposed to navigate to help pod learn. But some of it was gameplay, where you would see these video screens and you'd have to point and click on certain parts of the screens to reveal certain kinds of information. And some of it was just polls, where you were asked questions, right? How should I feel about my father? And a set of faces. So I think the question that comes up when you think about a piece of work like this is, where is the story? Like, if this is a narrative experience that's meant to be this sort of representation of Cronenberg's universe, where is the story in this? And the answer I want to give is everywhere. The story is everywhere in it. Now, some of that's obvious because some of it's video, and we know how videos tell stories, right? But I want to suggest that the story is just as much here in the pointing and clicking. I want to suggest even that the story is here in the polling. What we did with the polling is we would ask you these questions, and we would give you the chance to click an answer. But sometimes the system would register a different answer than you clicked and record that onto your profile, or threaten to send that answer to Twitter, or rewrite your answer as you were writing it. And it was all designed to make you distrust the system. That was the story we were going for. And so by just injecting that into polling, we created a new kind of experience for the story. It was the story told through a poll. That's what I mean, is that like I can tell story in these ways, and it's effective, we know that. But what I want to suggest to you is that I can tell story in these ways and get to similar kinds of storytelling. But obviously it's not the same, because there's no video here, there's no characters here. It's about the moment of interaction. So how does interaction tell stories? Like, how do we think about that? Let me give you another example. This is a non-digital example from other work I do. As an artist in game design, I make games for like that play in public. Like, we call them street games. So games you play in public spaces. I co-run a festival of this called Come Out and Play. And a few years ago, I decided to make a game for that festival called Kill Him and You Will Be Famous. This comes from an anime, by the way, that quote. Bonus points to anybody who can identify the anime. Without getting into detail of why I designed this game, because it's not important, basically what I wanted the game to be is an emulation of martial arts movies. And an emulation of a specific scene in a martial arts movie that you all know. It's the scene where the master takes on a room full of unnamed thugs. So maybe the martial arts master drops into a martial arts dojo, or walks into a police station, or falls through the roof of a bar. And then they have a fight with all of these thugs. And I wanted to do this because I thought it would be a fun kind of gameplay, where it's like one person versus like 12 people at once. So I watched a lot of these movies, right? Like I spent some time studying these movies, and I found that there's like a bunch of principles that exist in martial art group fights that are always true. Attackers always attack one at a time, which no sane person would ever do. You would just jump the martial arts master. But nobody does that. They very politely step up one at a time. The master could beat any one of them. If it was just one of them, the master's fine, right? The master has trouble because of the number. There's like 12 of them, and that causes a problem. The master always blocks or dodges before attacking. So when a new attacker comes up, the master never just punches them and they go down. Like the attacker swings a couple times, and then the master responds, right? So the combat has a rhythm that looks like... We don't have a lot of shame, game designers. Attackers go down very quickly when they're hit. You don't have to like hit them 5 times. You basically tap them in the chest and they fall. They come very quickly one after the other, and everybody's doing kung fu. Right? It's all kung fu strikes. So I wanted to think of a way to make this work. I wanted to create this narrative. And so I want to demonstrate this for you. And to do this, I will need a volunteer from the audience. Ideally, I'm going to give a couple of quick instructions in English, so I apologize about that. As a New Yorker, I am eternally ashamed that my Spanish is as pitiful as it is. But I just need one person to come up. It's going to be physical, but it will only last about 10 seconds.
Vamos, ¿quién se anima? Ahí, muy bien, perfecto.
Come up, please. Yes.
Valiente.
A round of applause for the volunteer. How's it going? Hi, what's your name?
David.
David, okay. So we're gonna play a game very quickly. We're gonna keep it a little contained. It's physical. Okay. Yeah. Well, he won't need that. He won't need that. We'll be good. All right. I am gonna pretend to be the martial arts master.
Okay.
And I am gonna wear this backpack. Okay. I'm the master. I'm the master.
Okay.
Okay. You are gonna be the attacker.
Okay.
Right? What I want you to do is to try to I want you to imagine you're holding a ball in your hand, in each hand. I want you to try to get a ball into this backpack.
I have to put it in the bag.
Yep.
Okay.
You got it?
Yeah.
All I can do is block and get out of your way.
Okay.
And you can't do anything to me except try to put the ball into my backpack. So you can't punch me, you can't hug me, you can't kick me.
Yeah, okay.
All right, you got it? Okay, ready? We'll go over here where it's a little bit safer. All right. Ready? Go. Thank you very much. Good, everybody. Okay, so what I want you to notice, as I try to correct the stage, is like the motions he was doing. Like what our bodies did immediately. Like how we related to each other, right? Suddenly, David was swinging at my head, right? You saw his fists come like this, right? And I'm blocking him. But he's not gonna hit my head because my head doesn't do anything. My head is an obstacle, so I'm safe. He's never gonna hit me. But he's gonna look like he hits me. He's gonna move like a martial artist, right? And I'm gonna move like a master because I can't strike him yet. Like all I can do is block. So this guy runs at me and I back up and I start blocking. Right? That's an embodied narrative. I didn't tell any martial arts story. I didn't even really have to frame what we did. I could have just told him that without any martial arts at all and it would have made sense. And so when I made this, I started, testing it. This is Greg Treffry, who co-runs Come Out and Play. That's a trash basket on string on his back. And those are tennis balls that you use to play with like little kids, like when you teach 4-year-olds how to play tennis. And we tested this out. We tried it multiple times until we got a mechanic that felt right, that felt like you were a master. You were surrounded by attackers. You didn't know who was going to come next. I call a number 1 and I scan the circle. And then someone comes at me and I block. For 15 seconds, I have to block. And then that person has to retreat. And when that person has to retreat, I can kill them. And then 2 comes in the circle immediately from some random direction. It looks like this. Narrative. It's a story experience. But it's a story experience that isn't told, it isn't shown, it isn't heard. It's played. All right, so how does this work? Well, if you're going to tell story through play, you kind of have to think about how to build story through play. And thankfully, there's a theory that approaches this. It's a very well-known theory in game design. It's not well-known outside of it, and I want to introduce it to you all. It's called MDA, Formal Approach to Game Design and Game Criticism. These are the people who made it. Robin Hunicke worked on Journey. Marc LeBlanc helped create Thief. Robert Zubek helped create Cityville. So these are very famous game designers. And they published this article as a result of workshops they were teaching about how to make games aesthetic. It's based on this kind of core idea that MDA stands for mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Mechanics are rules. It's like what you tell people to do. So at the start of a system, you sort of give them constraints. I told David, get the ball in my backpack, don't hit me, all I'm gonna do is block and dodge. Right? And we can think about, different components of different games. So like the parameters of a field or the traits of a Tetris shape or the units in StarCraft. Right? That gives me the space to interact. But once I have that space, then I create behaviors out of it. So now that David knows that he's got to get the ball into the backpack and he's got to not hit me, he starts to come up with movements, right? He gets low and is sort of pacing me and then he lunges. I didn't tell him to do that. He made that up. But he made it up from the rules I created. Those are dynamics. What players do with rules. And so all of that is emergent. It just comes out of what people do. And we can, again, see that in lots of games. We see that in certain kinds of plays, in sports. We see that in, the idea of a Tetris. Lining up the pieces so a 4 will clear 4 rows. If you don't know StarCraft, and this looks like just a big muddy mess, what you're looking at here is something called a Zerg rush, which is a standard strategy in StarCraft if you have the units called the Zerg. Because Zergs produce units faster than everyone else. So you can win a game of StarCraft as the Zerg by producing lots of units very fast at the beginning of the game. That is not a rule in StarCraft. That is a thing players discovered playing a thing that was made in StarCraft called the Zerg. So you have rules. The rules incent certain kinds of behaviors. The behaviors lead to certain kinds of play. And this is where it gets interesting. Once you're behaving a certain way, you start to feel certain things. Because your body's positioned a certain way. Because you're engaged a certain way. Because you're interacting a certain way. You're doing something. And that's going to make you feel something. And that feeling could be anything. It could be an emotion. It could be a story. It could be a theme. In a serious game, it could be like an educational lesson or a political point. but I can make a play style that leads you to a certain kind of feeling. And we know this because different kinds of games produce different kinds of feelings, right? So the exultation in sports, the one-minded focus that you have when you play Tetris, that like zoned out sense you get playing Tetris when you get really good, right? Or this sort of like hyper-quick, twitchy keyboard play of StarCraft. Like those are the results of the things we showed. So if my aim is to get you here, I want you to behave in a way that gets you to feel that, which means I want to create conditions in rules that make you behave that way. Rules create behavior, create emotion. How's that so far? All right, so let's see how this works in actual work, right? So this is a brand example. I like starting with this one because it's quite good. Is everybody familiar with this storyline? Right, so Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is basically a long, hopeless, painful slog through misery to an uncertain outcome. Right, and that's basically what it's about. It's about Frodo and Sam just trudging through misery like for a really long time, right? So it feels defeated, it feels painful, it feels hard, right? This is a story about people who suffer. We have lots of versions of this story, right? We have this version of this story, right? Which is the film. And that tells the story in its way. But the interesting thing is we also have games. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking of like the console games and all that sort of stuff, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the board game. The Lord of the Rings board game by Reiner Knizia, who's one of the great board game makers alive. What's interesting about Lord of the Rings is that the way Lord of the Rings works in the board game is that you each have these Hobbit characters, and this is your health bar. This is Sauron. Sauron gets closer and closer to you, and you basically play taking journeys on these boards where you have to move from location to location. And as you go, more bad things happen, and they just start to pile up. And it gets harder to get out of the boards, and some hobbits have to take health damage. And then you have to just give up on a board and leave it because you're not going to win, and you're going to die if you don't get out. And then one hobbit falls to Sauron, and then a second hobbit falls to Sauron, and then you're finally in Mordor. And it's like been a super hard, long journey of like playing all these stupid cards to like crawl your way towards the end. And most people who play this game fail. Like you win like 1 out of every 6 times. So what do you get? You get to play in these locations. You get to play with these characters, like all these characters we recognize, these actions we recognize of hiding and companionship. And you basically get a long, miserable slog through darkness and destruction that leads to an uncertain outcome. Now notice, like this is the game, right? There's a few more boards, but like this is basically what the game looks like. No text, no big giant red eye, right? No CGI orcs. But a system that replicates that idea, that replicates that experience. I have very limited ways I can move on these boards. They take a lot of resources, and I have to collaborate very closely with the people with me, and if we screw up or there's bad luck, it goes wrong very fast. So we play very cautiously, we stick very close together, we protect each other very carefully, and we're constantly scared we're going to die at any moment. And that is the story of Lord of the Rings. Played. Now, there are lots of models on how to do this. Like I'm not trying to suggest that there's one way of doing this. There's many, many ways of doing this. And if you study games, you'll see a lot of these ways. I'm going to go through them very quickly for you, just so you have like an image of them in your head. But like I advise you could dig deeper. I could do this much time on any one of these games to sort of illustrate how it works. You could look at games that riff off of cinema and think about the use of interaction through cutscenes and through short action scenes that kind of create narrative. This is The Last of Us, which is one of the strongest examples of that kind of work by Naughty Dog. You could, and in this case, the story is pretty linear. Like, I'm not going to change the story very much, but I'm going to embody the story by moving my way through it, and I'm going to use the techniques of films to create a sense of excitement. I could also look at it through a kind of lens of exploration. Like, maybe it's a space that I determine how I move through it. Like, I don't know what I'm going to find, and everything I uncover by stumbling around. But that might be in a simple game, like if in a very linear experience, like What Remains of Edith Finch by Giant Sparrow, or that might be in a very stripped-down mechanical experience, like Dysphoria by Anna Anthropy, Anna Anthropy's autobiographical meditation on her gender correction therapy, where you play through little games that reveal the experience of being transgendered. Or that could be in a giant world-exploring space, where everything in the world responds to the things I do, like Bethesda's work in Fallout 4. So maybe exploration can be your lens. Exploration of a single story, exploration of hundreds of stories, that you choose which stories you pursue. Or maybe I just put it in the real world. Like, I don't even make it digital. I just give you a big hotel. And I let the story run through the whole hotel, and then you find the story you want. You follow the actors that you want. Which is what Punch Drunk Sleep No More does. Or maybe I just stick to very simple mechanics. Maybe I don't need all that weight. Maybe I just make the decisions very simple. You're a border guard. You're in an old Soviet socialist republic. The government is corrupt and it changes all the time. And you are in charge of deciding who gets to immigrate into the country and not. You have two choices. You approve them or you deny them. That's all you do in the entire game. But they come to you with stories. Stories of fleeing oppression, stories of getting money where they're coming and sharing that money with you, stories of starting revolution. And some of them are people you shouldn't let in because their passport is wrong. And some of them are people you should because their passport is right. But you, the player, ethically, may feel like maybe you shouldn't follow the rules. You're allowed to miss 2 before your pay gets docked. And at the end of each round, you need to have enough money to feed your family, or your children could get sick and die. Do you let in the person whose gender doesn't match their passport? Do you let in the man who the women before said was a pimp and asked you to keep out for their safety? The game doesn't care. You get to miss 2, or then your family loses money. But in that process, Lucas Pope tells a story about ethics and bureaucracy and puts you in the position to make those ethical decisions, right? Through a simple mechanic that's just checking yes or no in a system that incents you to follow the rules but gives you enough space to make your own decisions. Or again, we do it non-digitally, right? In this game, The Grizzled by Fabienne Ruffo and Juan Rodriguez, where they emulate the experience of brotherhood that exists in wars by allowing you to play a band of people from the same town in World War I who are trying to survive the war by keeping the morale high as they face the horrors of the war. You know, and I want to make this point that I'm not talking about medium, right? I'm not talking about digital technologies. I'm not talking about emergent technologies. I'm talking about this concept of interaction that runs through all of these things. Like, that's what gameplay is about. And that's where we can tell stories if we want to. But if we think about how the decisions that users make reflect the story we want to tell, so that they embody the relationship of being a martial artist. They embody the sense of being a hobbit on a long, dangerous journey. They embody the sense of surviving the horrors of war. And games can do that, and interactive stories can do that. So I simply want to suggest to you that the interactivity is a part of that narrative experience. And if you're making transmedial work that involves interactivity, the interactivity is telling your story too. It only doesn't if you choose to ignore it. And then it just tells whatever random story that interactivity tells. But design the interactivity to tell the story, and then the interactivity can tell the story as well as all of the other medias do. Thank you.
Gracias, Nick. Thank you so much. Por favor. Bueno, vamos a prepararnos para algunas preguntas.
Let us get ready for
Para Nick.
a Q&A session with Nick. Nick,
Nuestra incipiente
Our
industria,
industry,
desarrollo,
which is developing virtual reality and immersive realities, is trying to develop
caminos con juegos. ¿Cómo están siendo las
pathways forward with games. How are experiences in the world with regards to new technologies, virtual reality, and games? Is the market receiving it well? Is it growing? Is it pushing forward the virtual reality world?
So I think one of the things that people who look at virtual reality from the film perspective often don't realize is that the best-selling high-end headset that exists in the world is the PlayStation VR, right? So I'm not saying that VR has taken over games by any means. I'm just saying that the PlayStation VR has shown a deep interest in gamers in virtual experiences. And I think that there's a kind of weird bifurcation right now in the world of VR, where like on one side is all the storytelling, on the other side is all the games, and they don't really communicate. Go to a VR arcade and you're going to play Super Hot, right? You're going to play Super Hot everywhere. Most people working in VR film have no idea what Super Hot is. Everyone in games knows what Super Hot is, right? But most people in games don't know what 0 days is. So I think that there's definitely an audience out there that bought these PlayStation headsets and is really curious about what the gameplay experiences are going to be. And I think that game design has a space to inform VR experiences because there is an inherent interactivity in VR, which is like, where do I look? Right? I think that we can inform a lot. I think the jury's still out about how much that's going to exist in the home, but the prevalence of these VR arcades popping up all over the place tells me that that's certainly going to exist as a consumer practice.
Okay, y en realidad aumentada.
And
después del
with
boom que
augmented
fue
reality,
Pokémon Go,
after
que sucedió
Pokemon
con
Go
ese juego,
and what happened
¿cómo
with that
impactó
game,
esta
how
industria?
did
¿Qué
this
está
have an
pasando en la
effect on the
industria de
industry?
juegos
What's
en
happening in the gaming
computador?
industry with regards to augmented reality?
So Pokemon Go was a singular object. And I think it took a little bit for people to realize that, right? That it wasn't, Pokemon Go, I mean, I think the thing that a lot of people don't know is that there were lots of attempts to do Pokemon Go-like things before Pokemon Go appeared, and none of them succeeded. And so Pokemon Go, and Pokemon Go's graph is that, right? It like got very, very big, and then it fell off very, very fast in terms of the majority of users. So I think it showed that there was an appetite for that kind of experience if you got the brand right and the play right and you got enough people doing it. The problem is making those three things happen. So I don't think, the reason why we haven't seen a lot of smaller AR plays really take off is because they can't. It's like, it's just, that's not how the system works. It has to be big. But you're now seeing like Star Wars starting to experiment with it, right? That's the next big one that's coming out. Walking Dead is starting to experiment with it. So you're seeing these larger brands start to approach it, and they may get the density necessary to make it happen. But I think as long as AR is still connected to your phone, it's always going to feel slightly primitive. I think we're a few years away from the prevalence of HoloLenses and Magic Leaps and those technologies. And when those technologies appear, I think that's the point where the world is really going to change.
Okay, mi última pregunta antes de
My
pasar.
last question before I go to the audience. In Argentina, in our regions, in South America, there is a film production that is quite big. For soap operas, for films, for TV programs, there's intellectual property that's more or less popular. But generally, our producers, and there are many colleagues here, Many creators of intellectual property, they do not know how to expand their content towards games. Our contents do not expand naturally towards games. There are very successful products where there's no game attached to it. What's your recommendation to these producers who are creating intellectual property to go forward and move onto that platform?
I think that the opportunity for games in those platforms as brand extension is very big, because no matter what you're doing with these properties, there's a space that the brand doesn't occupy by the very nature of the time focus of these media, right? Like, if I watch something on television or I watch something in film, there's just a limited amount of time I can dedicate to it before more material has to be produced. So what transmedia does really well in those environments is it fills that time. It gives people other things they can do. And I think, again, if you look at like Disney with Star Wars as a model, like, there's just the release schedule is just relentless around all their material, because they're just trying to capture the attention of their fans without cessation. So, and games become part of that. Let's make a VR lightsaber experience. Let's release another Lego Star Wars game. Let's keep something in the brand. What's nice about games as objects is that games can extend for very long periods of time. Like, a good game can last 20 hours easily, right, from a single piece of content. So that's valuable. Now, if you're thinking that, like, well, what I make is a soap opera, it's not going to be a first-person shooter, right? It's not going to be like a mecha battle game. What can I make that makes sense? Well, the question there is really, well, are there games that audience plays, right? Like that demographic plays? And the answer is yes, because everybody plays games now. And casual games had wild success about 10 years ago, like looking at hidden object games, mystery-based games, right? That were all based on the same kind of narratives you would see in those spaces. So what I would suggest is, like, if you're working on something that you don't really see transmedial possibilities for, because you look at the world of games and you're just like, all of this stuff is for 19-year-old boys, I don't know how this matches my audience, what I would suggest is look at the game-playing habits of your population. Like, what kinds of games do they actually play? And could you spin your narrative off into one of those games? My guess is you probably can, and if you do, you give that audience a chance to not only monetize further on the brand, but to live with the brand for longer periods that can extend beyond the natural constraints of film material.
Wow, interesante.
Very interesting. That gives me some clues. Any questions from the audience? Any questions for Nick? Nick is going to be meeting professionals in a little while with the interactive and games chambers. There's no questions? Yes, one up at the top.
Hola.
Hi. When you talked about novel, the soap opera, and how you can attract a specific audience to a type of game, I was thinking about Second Life experience, where there were scenarios, there were no rules to that game, but there was a certain interaction between different participants. When you speak about games for that kind of audience, are you thinking of creating scenarios where you incentivize interaction, and with virtual reality in that sense, there would be a more versatile tool, right?
I mean, there's no, like, when I say game in this context, like, there's not like a single model that I'm thinking about there. And so to your point, yeah, there are some of these experiences that particularly older women have been attracted to in the games industry have often been these open-ended story experiences. So The Sims was probably the monster in the room for a really long time, of like what sucked up a lot of attention from that audience. The game before that was Myst, right? Like, it was a puzzle mystery game that was hugely successful with that audience. So yeah, I'm not suggesting that there's like a particular formula to these kind of to these structures of interactivity and choice and feedback that are absolutely right in all these contexts. And I certainly wouldn't ever go to a soap opera and basically say, like, all you need to do is reskin Call of Duty and you're fine, right? I think that it's really a question of looking at what are the interactions that the audience wants and how can they interact with the narrative in a way that makes sense. If I'm interested in soap operas, what do I want to experience? Do I want to experience certain kinds of melodrama? Do I want to experience certain kinds of relationship knowledge? Do I want to explore love or sex or humor? Like what is it that I'm like aiming at? And then how can I build interactive experiences that hit those things particularly? And I think you're right. Like something that's open-ended, something that allows people to tell stories is definitely one of the potential spaces. But then on the other hand, like I said, the games that were very popular with people in those spaces, at least in the last big wave of dominance, were games that were more exploratory and more narratively controlled. So I think there's a lot of space to experiment. And I think there's a lot of ways to experiment. I just want to point out again that the first thing I showed you in this talk was not a game, right? It was a media property that used game-like elements, and I'm very much in favor of being totally not purist about what games are and how they work.
Bien,
Sí.
¿alguna pregunta más? Ya vamos a ir cerrando.
Sí.
Por ahí.
We're going to close pretty soon. Last question. There in the center.
¿Cuál es el sentido?
What
¿Qué
is
es lo que
the
lo llevó a
sense? What
diseñar
took you
juegos?
to
Es una
design
pregunta
games?
personal.
It is a personal
¿Cuál fue la
question.
motivación
What was
para
your
llegar a
motivation
diseñar juegos?
to design
¿Y cuál
games?
es el sentido que
And
tiene
what
el
is the
juego
sense
en la
that games
construcción de
have in the
narrativas?
construction of narratives for you?
What interests me, I won't do my personal history because we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to share that later. It's weird and it won't make any sense. What interests me about the way interactivity tells stories is that usually when you consume a story, you're on a roller coaster, right? You walk into the movie theater, you load something up on Netflix, you turn on your TV, you go to the theater, you put the seatbelt on, you lean back, and the narrative happens to you. And that's amazing. It's amazing how well that works. We have mastered that. But there's a whole other way to have a story. I go into a relative's house that I haven't been in a really long time, someone I don't know anymore, and I look around their house, and I look at the pictures, and like I choose where to look. Like I'm looking at that picture and that picture, because I see a picture of like somebody surfing, and I'm like, who surfed here? Did my uncle used to surf? That's crazy. Oh, look, there's a surfboard. I wonder what that surfboard is. And I'm ignoring the grandkids, and I'm ignoring the books on the shelves. I'm ignoring the trophies. I'm navigating that way, and I'm like, oh, he was a surfer. I get it. And then I see the family, and I say, oh, and he married another surfer. But my sister walks in the house, and the first thing my sister looks at are the books. And my sister says, there's a philosopher here. Like, look at all this philosophy. Oh, it's sort of like some kind of Eastern philosophy. I think this person was a hippie. Some kind of hippie lives here. And then sees the photo, and it's like, oh, a hippie married a hippie. Right? And both of those stories could be true. But what I feel that's different here is that I told that story, because I found that stuff. Now, I didn't put the pictures in the house, right? I didn't make the story up. The story was already there. I just found it the way I wanted to find it. And that meant I discovered it. And I feel like that discovery is this whole other kind of narrative experience that it's very hard for linear media to recreate. I don't think interactive media replace linear media at all. I don't think that games can tell stories as well as film or theater or books can. They tell those stories very, very well. There's this other kind of story that games can tell. Stories about discovery, stories about accomplishment and triumph, stories about frustration and failure that are unique to interactivity. And those stories fascinate me because I love the idea of making a playground and letting you play in it and not knowing exactly what you're going to do.
Muchas gracias, Nick. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.